the same experiment with like speakers of 6 or 7 different languages. And this has probably been the hardest time, like designing that experiment was, out of anything I've done, probably the hardest time in terms of trying to think about these factors that need to be controlled, because we wanted the exact same stimuli for all of these speakers. So it really restricts what kinds of things you need to think about, what kinds of things you need to do and not do. So I was thinking a bit about this experience and coming up with some of the thoughts I have today. So the way I sort of envisioned this session working is we're going to start out with sort of a brainstorming session just to get all of you thinking about, hey, what kinds of things might I need to think about in designing one of these experiments? So I think we'll do that in breakout rooms so that you can sort of feel comfortable talking with a smaller group of people and everyone can share their ideas and get their thoughts about them. Then we'll come back together and sort of brainstorm together, I guess, taking together everyone's ideas and talking about them. And after that, I have a sort of menagerie of factors and things and tips and advice that I have. And we'll look through some of that, like one factor at a time, of things that I think it's worth thinking about very carefully when you're designing these experiments, and some just kind of advice I might have after doing it many times. Okay, so I'll put these slides up for your reference again, like the other ones on my webpage sometime later today. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is we'll go into breakout rooms, assuming we can figure out how to do that. And I'd like you to sort of, I guess this is sort of your first social kind of event of this workshop, so feel free to take a few minutes to sort of introduce yourselves to each other. But then from there, I'd like you to just brainstorm with your group. Just what are some factors, things that you might want to consider when designing stimuli for an experiment? I sort of have in mind a sort of morphophonology experiment here. But if you have other factors that you think might be relevant for any other kind of experiment, feel free to bring those up as well. So what are just some factors that you might want to think about and issues that might come up? And then we'll see what you come up with, and we'll come back together and discuss it all together. Okay. How do I do this?
Do you see the breakout rooms button? It's by the one that says, like, put your hand up in a smiley face. Or I
don't think I have it.
Okay,
maybe it's on like the host.
I'm gonna do it, and we're gonna see what happens.
Okay.
So how many of us are there? We're about 20. What size groups do you want, Jamie?
I'd say about 4, maybe. It's a good size.
Groups of 4. So I'll make like 5 rooms, and we'll see how that goes.
I should say we'll go on for like maybe 10 or so minutes and see how we're getting on.
Okay, sounds good. And all of us are going to go into rooms, so you might have an organizer of this workshop in your room, but we'll try to stay quiet-ish. Okay. Do you see something? Do you see anything? Does anyone see anything? I see a bunch of rooms. I see a bunch of rooms, but now I don't know what to do with them.
Nothing changed for us, I think.
Okay.
I like how we were all very quiet, like in case something had happened,
Okay, I'm opening the rooms.
Oh, good. That looks good.
What do you see?
You'll automatically be moved in 10.
So I guess it worked.
Hi.
Hey.
So we are 3 in the room.
I think we're 4.
4?
No? Yes.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Andras.
I'm Remy.
I'm Jenny. that all of us in this room?
Yeah, Chan is also here.
Sorry, there was just you. Please go ahead, you guys, because there's a couple more people trickling in, and I need to assign them to
Yeah.
rooms.
So we are supposed to talk about anything that we can control or we are supposed to control.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. So I'll start by saying that I'm a syntactician, morphosyntactician. So morphonology is not what I usually deal with, but that's maybe good. I have to think of something
Okay.
else then.
And then for me, it's the totally opposite. I don't like syntax. I'm on the phonological phonetic side.
Perfect.
But usually I don't do experiments. So
Yeah,
I'm more
okay.
like in the quantitative side of phonology phonetics. So, but I assume you always have to control the same things if you do syntactic experiments.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that I noticed in some of Jamie's things before was that he had very simple syllable structures, right? He went for CV, CVC stuff.
Yeah, but that depends on the experiment you want to do.
Sure, but if you're looking for phonological stuff, it might be. I mean, if you're looking for the vowel harmony stuff, maybe then you don't want to make things too complicated, right? That's probably a general theme, maybe.
Yeah, usually we control for the. He say that for the consonant and vowel, he control for the frequency.
Yeah.
Things like that, and he also said that the stimuli that have been recorded were produced by another speaker from a different language. But again, that will depend on the task on the you want your speakers, your people to do.
Yeah, I guess you want to strike a balance, right? You want someone that you can pass easily enough, but that doesn't sound exactly who might not be native in the language that you speak as well, right? Or that the participants speak, I mean.
Yeah. And I think like also we could go for more basic stuff, but you have to control for age or
Sure,
social economical status, like maybe a region. Because if you do like phonological studies, maybe you want to restrict to one specific area. Maybe monolingual speaker, it's really important, or bilingual, depending on what you want.
Yeah.
You have to control for if they speak several languages, which is basically most of the time their level in, for example, let's say English, French, or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, I thought the point of the discussion about whether you have written or auditory stimuli was interesting because with the syntaxy stuff that I've been reading about mostly, I think that was more of a secondary concern to some degree. Hello.
Hi, Sonia.
Hi, Sonia. Welcome to a different room. Finally, sorry about that.
Sorry, we were just juggling people who are in rooms by themselves and such. So sorry for being quiet.
Hi, I'm Andras. We've started talking a bit about the things going on that we think are relevant.
Andras, were you in the middle of saying something?
I was just talking about how I've mostly read things about syntactic experiments of this sort, and so I hadn't really thought too much about the written versus auditory stimuli side of things. It made a lot of sense, of course, that with Jamie's experiments that he was talking about, that hearing those things is the relevant thing, and not presenting them in a written form is more important. Yeah.
Has someone mentioned? Sorry, do you have any ideas, Sonia? Otherwise, I'll say something else to make it something conversation flowing.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what you discussed before. Like I have some experience in general with artificial learning experiments. So I studied quantifiers and universals in quantifiers. And for me, one thing that was like one difficult thing is that like the frequency of quantifiers, and the other participants will learn quantifier in the experiment, or they more learn like general. So, for example, if we have something like at least 5, you will learn at least 5, or some other type of quantifier, or maybe just they learn to which type of stimuli they should react. Yes or no. Yeah, that type of things. That try to control.
Sorry, it was cutting out a little bit for me, so I didn't catch that last part.
Same.
Yeah, so I only said about like this two things. So one was like the frequency of quantifier that I wanted to teach participants.
Do you mean the frequency of quantifiers like in natural language, or the frequency with which they appear in your experiment? I mean, I can imagine both would be relevant.
If I teach them monotone rule, for example, something like at least 5, this is something that also in natural language. So the problem is because we have already this bias of monotonicity in natural language, so in a way maybe it's just frequency and not really the learning thing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I was also going to say, you know, if you're doing any kind of experiment, no matter what domain, you have to think about to what degree your stimuli resemble the natural language. So just even beyond like who's the speaker, you know, do they sound like an English speaker? Do they sound like a French speaker? You know, are you cueing participants into something accidentally by the way your words look or sound? So that's something we definitely think about even in syntax studies, because, you know, if you're designing, or semantic studies, right? If you're designing some new determiners, should you make them like natural language determiners in some way? Should you, do you want them to look like plausible English words? Probably, but you don't really do you want them to be short? Do you want them to be, you know, all these things you've got to think about, because they're probably going to have repercussions in terms of how participants are doing the mapping between what they've experienced and what they're. Here's someone furiously typing.
Oh, sorry.
This is the problem with like mics, and I do the same thing. I forget to mute my mic and then I type it away. Yeah, I mean, there's also like the issue of what your stimuli mean. So I was actually wondering for Jamie's stuff, you know, it's basically always like it's singular or plural. But I wonder a bit, like, does that have any ramifications? Why use that? Is there anything about how that would interact? But yeah, I mean, for my own experiments, I'm always wondering, should the stimuli be real stuff that people always have words for? Should they be funny objects that people have never seen before, and therefore they don't have a pre-existing word for it? You know, similarly for determiners, like, do you use determiner meanings that are out there, or do you try to teach people all novel determiner meanings? That's not easy to do, but.
Yeah, with the. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, the problem is also that sometimes these properties are correlated, right? So because the universal actually says that the lexicalized quantifiers are those that satisfy, so it's already very much constrained the one I can use to control for example, for this aspect, that they are not a single word.
Mm-hmm.
So this complexity is controlled.
Yeah, I just thought of because you mentioned this, Jenny, this the singular plural thing. I mean, in many languages there will be a kind of iconic relationship between the singular and the plural, right? But that's something that doesn't have to be the case. So it's something to consider, I guess, depending on the languages of the participants that are involved. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I think in Jamie's own work, he's very careful about having like random draws from a possible lexicon, or, you know, in the last experiment that he showed us, where you've got different possible versions of the language, so that you know it's not the difficulty of some other thing. You've got like several examples of potentially neutralizing rules. Yeah, so that's something else to think about. So if you're having if it's really tricky to design new determiners, maybe you need to do it a couple of times to make sure there isn't something about the particular one that you created.
Okay. One thing I've seen in should we?
Yeah.
Okay.
You say one more thing, and then I'm the one who gets to open and close these rooms, so you go.
Okay. So the one thing I've seen some differences on is whether you invent a whole set of lexical items for an experiment, or whether you use lexical items that are part of the participants' languages and just add some elements to that. So when it comes to case marking and agreement, for example, which are relatively complex relations in a clause, whether what kind of confounds you might be introducing if you use the lexical items from the language that the participants know, and then just add artificially created suffixes or prefixes to that, or whether you come up with a complete new set of items. I find that an interesting point as well. I don't know what has an accepted wisdom about those cases.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've gone back and forth about in my own work. Sometimes using basically English words and reordering them for a study on word order, sometimes using fake morphemes and attaching them. And unfortunately, I don't really think, I don't think there's any kind of systematic study, looking at what are the effects of that. I think it's just kind of study by study, thinking about, okay, what could the problems be?
Mm-hmm.
It's just a matter of like, how creative are you in thinking of what the problems might be?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Thanks all. That was interesting. I'm going to bring us all back together now. So hopefully I'll close this room and we'll all see each other in the room.
We're back. The magic is gone.
Sorry if I ended up cutting off anyone mid-sentence. I probably just should have, I don't know. But in any case, it worked reasonably well.
We should have received a warning, like from the Big Brother.
Okay.
You will now be pulled off from breakout rooms. Stop saying anything bad about the organizers.
Yeah, well,
we did get a warning because we were like, oh, we better stop gossiping now.
Oh.
10 seconds before, it's like, we're going to put you back.
Yeah.
We're gonna put you back.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
So, all right. Well, I hope you had at least a few minutes to talk about some ideas. So I figure now we'll sort of come together. So I'm happy if you want to share any ideas that came up in your sessions that you thought are interesting, and I'll endeavor to maybe write them on this lovely white slide.
Should we say them or write them on the chat? What's easier?
Probably say them if you don't mind. That's easier for me, at least. I actually find it's a bit difficult for me to see the slide and video and the chat at the same time. Wow.
So one thing that Elizabeth said that I thought was very interesting is that you use visuals in many of these studies, especially when you want to do like implicit learning, right? You want them to kind of learn whatever you're teaching them through description of a picture or something like that. Like you had the walnuts before and the strawberries and so on. Mm-hmm. Would the things like visual complexity and other differences between possible graphs that you use, would that matter? And then a separate concern, but also refers to the visuals, is would it matter that they are more or less common words or concepts or something like that for them to be learned quicker by the participant?
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on the on the visuals? Or put another way, how could the types of pictures that you might pick matter? Sorry, by you, that could be anybody, actually. How could the types of pictures that you use matter? Or
I was keeping quiet because I thought maybe Elizabeth wanted to say something because she brought it up. I think this was really purely in the brainstorming spirit. So we don't have an answer for that. We're just wondering whether it would, and whether you have an idea of whether it would matter. I mean, I know we control for frequency of stuff, right? When we use actual words, or we use lexical stems and stuff like that. So it's a leap in a way to go from whether words frequent to whether concepts frequent. But I mean, for lexical learning, it matters. For stuff like phonology, I don't know if it matters whether you would you learn like a vowel association or a suffix faster if you have less trouble with the stem and stuff like that. I don't know.
Yeah, so in a phonology kind of experiment, I think normally we use pictures mainly just as it's sort of like almost like a fake bit of information. Like in most cases, we don't really care what the words mean in a phonology experiment, but they're just kind of arbitrarily assigned some kind of meaning or some kind of picture to go with them. But I still think that the pictures do matter still, and there's still things to think about in terms of the pictures. Would anyone else like to sort of chime in? I should say, I assume if you're doing an experiment more like on the semantic side, then the visuals and the pictures matter a lot. Like in that case, it's more of sort of probably related to the critical aspect of the study. In a phonology experiment, normally it's not really a critical part of the study what the picture is. Any ideas? Okay. Oh yeah. So for pictures, I'll come back to this a bit later, but I think for phonology experiments, the main thing you want to avoid with the pictures is making sure you don't accidentally introduce some kind of confound. I think that's the big thing with phonology experiments. So people will look for patterns in the pictures that you give them. And in phonology, we don't really usually care what the picture is, but people will look there for it. So you have to really make sure that you don't accidentally introduce some kind of confounding pattern where they can look at a certain picture and use that to get the right answer. But people definitely do, even if it's a phonology experiment, they do sort of look for patterns like you make this phonological change when it's animate or a fruit or whatever kind of semantic category you can think of. Yeah, Andras?
Yeah. So you had strawberries and walnuts before, right? In those pictures. Some that you showed us earlier, I think.
Yeah.
So first of all, does it matter as well whether participants recognize those things? I mean, would that be a confound as well if they know some of them but don't recognize one of the fruits or whatever you have there? And kind of another question I have is what other pictures you showed there to kind of make sure that you don't have a human and then strawberries and walnuts or something.
Yeah, so typically I'd use kind of just everyday objects and things like that. I don't worry too much if it's something that they happen like not to know the word for. Yeah, it's just something that I worry about too much. Like if they don't know the word for that nut or fruit or something, they happen not to know the word for it. I don't worry too much about that. But I definitely try to make sure, for instance, that there's not something like, all the food items happen to go with this kind of item, or all of the animate items happen to go with this kind of item, or something like that. So I like actively control for those things when I'm making the pairings. So if I have like two conditions or two types of items or something, then I'll put a fruit with this type and then a fruit with the other type, and then a animate thing with this type and then animate thing with that type, and a bird with this type and a bird with that type, and like actively control that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I meant more that not so much that the participant doesn't know the name of an item, but that they don't know the concept, so to speak. Whether that could confuse them.
What do you mean by don't know the concept?
So say I've never seen a strawberry, or something like that, and then I'm one of the pictures is a strawberry in the experiment that I'm participating in. That I've never seen the thing that is there.
Oh, right.
So I don't know whether it matters if you have a mix of known and unknown things. But that was just something that crossed my mind.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so when I do these, I usually use things that I'm pretty sure everyone has seen before, like any adult will recognize the thing. It sort of reminds me, though, of a different issue a little bit, which is that sometimes you'll see people that basically say, this is some other language in the world that you're not familiar with. And then other people will do the experiments and say, this is an alien language, or this is a language, and here are names for aliens, or something like that, something like off the wall, like that. And sometimes in that case, people might use pictures of like aliens or something, or something that people wouldn't have seen before. Those are two different ways that it's done. I personally prefer to do the route of trying to trick people into thinking that it's a real language, and therefore I use regular objects and hope that they think, I think pretty successfully, usually often, that they think, oh, this is just some language that I haven't heard before, but these are real words and real items in this language. I think it's pretty successful because I'd say quite often people afterwards would be like, oh, I know that language. I think that's whatever, I think that's Korean, or I think that's, whatever language, which of course it's not, it's artificial. But I personally like that because I worry a little bit about this little nuance that if you tell someone it's an alien language, that they're primed to go into the task thinking, this is a language not like Earth languages. This is a language that's different than the natural languages. Therefore, I'm going to think things that seem unusual to me are more likely because it's an alien language. So I'm just a little bit worried about that kind of nuance. So I tend to tell people, oh, this is a real language that you're probably not familiar with, and you're going to learn some items in this language.
Just to interject very quickly here, it's really worth noting that there is a kind of probably divide here between what people tend to do when they're doing experiments with children and what people tend to do when they're doing experiments with adults. So with children, you've got some other considerations that you have to consider. Like, is this gonna catch? Is this gonna make? Are they gonna pay attention to this, or are they gonna just be bored out of their minds? So there are some kind of things to juggle there. And I mean, me personally, I've sort of gone back and forth about the whole alien language or not alien. I mean, I've done lots of experiments in both ways, and it doesn't seem to make much of a difference. I think Alex convinced me that it's nicer to do things in a way where it's kind of more naturalistic in a way. People don't treat it as a game. So I'm less concerned about whether people think, oh, this is an alien language, therefore it's going to be weird, because I don't think people really know what's weird for language.
Yeah.
But I do think they might think, okay, this is a game we're playing, so I need to figure out what the answer is, as opposed to thinking, okay, I'm listening to a natural language and I don't know how it works. Maybe that's better. But
yeah, I also I don't think that it would make a difference whether it's an alien language or a real language in what people do. I don't think it probably would, but as far as I know, we don't know, in the sense that I don't think anyone has ever done an experiment where the manipulation is whether it's said that it's a real language or an alien language, and whether it affects what people do. But so
yeah, we have stuff that's kind of close to that approach, but never designed to answer that question. So
yeah. Yeah, I should say I'm mainly here talking about adult experiments as well. Children experiments, there's a whole separate set of issues as well that you have to worry about, as Jenny said. Yeah.
And sorry, just to add to this, I think it also matters what are you testing, because I mean in semantics it does happen quite a lot that you are testing concepts that are not lexicalized by one particular word, and then it's very hard to basically try to teach people by just saying that you are going to teach them a new language, but then the concepts that you're going to try to teach them are also completely new to them. So that's also where maybe having this alien language or something on those lines might be helpful, because you also need to introduce new concepts or concepts that no language has words for example.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
So-
sure.
I think there's a student question.
Yes, Jenny?
Yeah. Hello, Professor. This is not a question, but continue our topic. What are the factors to consider when designing stimuli? And as far as I'm concerned, when I create some phrases, I have to consider the counterbalance in terms of the animacy or gender or whether it is human-made. For example, in the animate category, we have to classify the phrases into like humans and animals, and in the non-animate category, we have to consider whether the things are human-made. For example, the tables, they are human-made, but the trees, the cloud, the sun, they are not human-made and they are non-animate. And also we have to consider the frequency of the phrases, if they are real phrases, not pseudo phrases. So the frequency of the words should be high or should be acceptable. And also, as the professor mentioned above, we have to consider whether the participants are children or adult. But I want to add something that we have to consider their language background, because if we try to design some experiments which involves for example, the writing direction of the sentence, then if we have to test this, if we have to test the writing direction from right to left, then we have to exclude some participants whose language backgrounds are related to the Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew, because these languages are written from right to left. Yeah, and this is what I want to say. Thank you.
Good. Very good. Yeah, so we definitely want to consider any kind of factors that we might want to counterbalance that was mentioned. So, there's a couple of ways we can control for things. We can perfectly control it so it's the same for everybody. Or if that's not possible, we can do some counterbalancing so that half the people get something and half the people get something else. And we also want to consider the language background of our subjects, probably for any kind of artificial language study in any domain. I would guess that's going to be really important. Good. Other thoughts? So one thing I sort of, I guess a prompt that I put in the chat, if you were feeling stuck, is one thing you could think about is imagine you're going to do if you're going to do some kind of phonology experiment, you have to make words for this language. It's artificial language. So what are some things you need to think about when you're going to start making words? Like what goes into the words? What are you going to think about if you're going to write down some words that are going to be in this language? Yeah, comment from Maria.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Yeah, so I think we have to take into account if we are doing the kind of Thyssen and Saffron experiment or Saffron strings, that none of the syllables, for example, should be a real word if we're really using pseudo words or non-words. And same for that the concatenation of the syllables also doesn't create any real words. And then as well for saliency, so maybe we cannot introduce a lot of plosives or a lot of t's, these, whatever, within the same word. So we really want to control for that, that we're not biasing or we are introducing any co-articulation cues in the strings or in the language.
Mm-hmm. This would be easier if I was using a tablet, probably. Okay, yeah. So we want to think about not having anything that's a real word or sounds like a real word is probably useful. Thinking about the saliency of our stimuli. So are there patterns or things in the words that particularly stick out or sound unusual or sound odd or anything like that? Other thoughts?
Maybe I'll just leap in.
Yeah, yes.
I was thinking about syllable structure. I think if I remember correctly, the examples you showed were largely, CV syllables. And maybe you want to mix it or maybe you don't want to mix it. But that's another decision, I guess. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about different syllable structures and why you might use one over the other?
I'm not a phonologist, so this might be a naive answer, but the thing that occurs to me immediately is sort of the sense of, I guess closeness to the native syllable structure, and like looking at your examples looked more exotic than syllable structure of English. So there's sort of, I don't know, it makes it look more like a different language, I guess, if you choose a syllable structure that's not close to the background that the participants have.
Okay, yeah, so it can be, the syllable structure can sort of emphasize or de-emphasize or make it seem more or less like the participant's first language, depending on what you choose. Yep.
And I guess it also probably has to do with the phenomenon you care about. Like with vowel harmony, you want a lot of vowel action.
Yeah. Yep. Good. For vowel harmony, yeah, we want a lot of vowel action. I like that. It's a good way of putting it. And probably minimal consonant interference, right? So that makes CV, CV, CV like a pretty good sort of structure for that kind of experiment. Someone in the chat mentioned phonotactics, which is definitely important for phonology experiments. So if you're not familiar, phonotactics is basically the sort of rules that govern what's a possible word in a language, or possibly what's a good or a likely or less likely word in a language. So you definitely want to think about the phonotactics of the participant's first language and whether or not, and to what extent you want it to be like or dislike those. Other thoughts?
mean, I'd like to hear more about what you guys think in terms of, I mean, again, this all kind of wraps back around to the interaction with participants' first language. But I mean, if you're playing people some audio of phonotactics or syllable structures, or even just the sound inventory of the language that they've never heard before, that seems problematic. So I'd be curious to know, yeah, what you guys think of when you're dealing with that. I mean, from a syntax perspective, we're dealing with like similar questions, but they don't interact as much with, the main research question. Mainly we're trying to make sure that people can actually learn the words of the language in a way that's not disrupted by having, sounds that they are not familiar with. And sometimes we want people to actually produce the language, in which case they need to be able to say the words in some way. But yeah, I'd be curious to know what else you think about that.
Are you talking to me or to the general everybody?
Everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, I have thoughts about this, but I also would be interested to hear other people's thoughts. Yeah, I should say I'm going to touch on a lot of these. Part of the reason why I'm not like on these points saying like here's everything I think about this is because I'm going to touch on some of these points in more detail later as well. I'm sort of like interested to hear everyone else's ideas on these before I give my like stamp of this is what I think as the quote unquote expert on this. Yeah, any thoughts about that question? It's a good one that Jenny raised. So like that does matter a lot in phonology, right? Like do you have these phonotactics and you're going to play people these words that may or may not match them? Should I give you an example to think about? So in English, lax vowels cannot occur like in open syllables. So what if you want to have a lax vowel in a word and you want a word like goziba with like an ah there at the end? That's not a possible word in English. You can't have a word ending in ba. So what do we think is going to happen there? I mean, they'll hear this word ba ending in ba, goziba. But what happens after that point? Like, what if they repeat the word to themselves? If they're an English speaker, they're less likely to repeat to themselves goziba. They might say something like goziba or gozibe, gozibe. Who knows what they're going to say, but goziba. So some other vowel. Like, should we be worried about that kind of thing? Yes, Andras?
To me, that seems like it's also a question of whether there's one that sticks out, or whether, I mean, if you have something like that across all your items, maybe that's not so much of a problem because they might all be affected in the same way. But I mean, maybe it's best to avoid that in the first place. But I guess the worst situation is if you have one or two elements that stick out, being unnatural in this sense, and everything else kind of doesn't show this property. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it kind of gets back to the issue, you're saying of like, if certain things stick out as odd or unusual, or people tend to remember them because there's something unusual about them. So yeah, it seems likely that if you are otherwise in a set of normal from the perspective of English words, and then they hear this word that doesn't match the phonotactics, it's going to stick out to them as unusual. Yeah. Part of my concern of it is that if people are repeating the words to themselves as part of their sort of task of learning the words, or learning something about the words, and they repeat it to themselves in a way that's not consistent with what you want the word to be, then you lose control over what it is that they're learning from. Like they've created almost this new input for themselves, this new example for themselves to learn from, and that's concerning. Okay, so I think I'll just continue on and talk about some of the issues I sort of have prepared, which is a lot of these issues and some other ones, and we'll have time to talk about each of them in more detail as we go through this process anyway. Okay, So yeah, I should give a caveat here that a lot of this section is my own thoughts and advice, which we can discuss. But again, as I sort of said earlier, this doesn't mean that it's like the exact perfect way, best way to do things. This is just some of my thoughts on ways that I tend to do things and some thoughts that I have. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So the first thing I thought I would bring up is, this isn't per se about stimuli, but something that's really important to think about when you're designing an experiment. And that's the issue of whether it's going to be a sort of implicit task or an explicit task. And in these experiments, this is sort of it's a continuum, right? So a task can be very implicit or very explicit, or it can be somewhere in between, like sort of explicit, but with some implicit components, or vice versa. But there's some good recent research about this that you can read about from Elliot Morton and Pertsova, that talks about things that make tasks more or less explicit and what that does to what people learn from those tasks and how they learn in the task. So some things that you want to think about are things that make a task more implicit is you don't give them feedback. So if you give people feedback on the task, then that makes it much more explicit. So feedback would be like when they're learning, you say, is it A or B? And then they say A, and then you say, no, that's wrong, it's B. So that's feedback during learning. And giving people feedback during learning makes it much more explicit what's going on. The instructions can contribute. So giving vague instructions makes the task a bit more implicit. So just saying something like, listen to these words and we'll ask you about them later. Like, that's pretty vague instructions. And that'll make people approach it from a more implicit point of view. Versus if you tell them, we're going to show you pairs of singulars and plurals in a new language. We want you to pay attention to what's different about them and learn how to make a plural from a singular or something. You know, if you give them more explicit instructions, they'll approach it with a more explicit sort of mindset. If the pattern itself is something that's sort of difficult to describe in plain English, then people tend to look at it more implicitly, like learn more implicitly about the pattern. If it's something that's easy to describe, like, oh yeah, P turns into B at the end of the word or something, then people will be more likely to look for an explicit kind of pattern. And in terms of phonology, at least, if the alternations aren't obvious, or you're only looking at phonotactics and there's not alternations, these kinds of tasks tend to be more implicit. And if you make the alternations, they're really obvious. So most of the tasks that I described to you earlier were quite explicit in this regard. They get the pairs, they get a singular, they get a plural, they're next to each other. You can see both of them at the same time, or sorry, hear both of them at the same time. It's very obvious there that there's some kind of change happening. And so that's pretty explicit. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind because you sort of get different behavior depending on how implicit or explicit the task is. So implicit tasks tend to promote more intuitive learning. So if you ask people afterwards, they'll say things more like, I just went with what sounded best, or, you know, I went with my gut, what seemed right. They also give you a sort of gradual learning curve. So the curve might look more like this, where people sort of kind of get slowly better over time, and then maybe, you know, asymptote at some point. Arguably, this might be more like natural learning, which we think is more kind of implicit in nature, especially first language learning. But these tasks are also more difficult to design. It's really hard to figure out often good ways to train people on something implicitly. And they also take much longer. So usually if you can design it, you're talking about an experiment that's much longer in length. The sort of explicit experiments, on the other hand, these tend to promote rule seeking. So at the end of the experiment, people are more likely to tell you something like, yes, I found the pattern. It's, you know, anytime you have E or A, the next vowel is going to be E or A, like something very explicit. For these kinds of tasks, you tend to get a sharp learning curve. So it looks more like this, where people don't know what to do, they don't know what to do, they don't know what to do, and then suddenly they know it. They found the rule and they know what to do from then on. This at least arguably, is less like natural learning, at least first language learning. Maybe it's more like second language learning. But these are much less difficult to design, and they're much quicker, which is why you'll see many, many, many experiments that have a more explicit design. It's much easier and quicker to do these experiments. Okay, I should say at any point, please, this is still interactive or meant to be interactive, so please stop me with questions at any point, questions or comments. All right. Okay, so one thing that you definitely have to think about doing a phonology experiment, probably the thing I think about first out of anything, is what is the phoneme inventory or the phonetic inventory going to be of this language? So just to give you a sort of flavor of why this is really important in terms of designing an experiment, in phonology at least. So imagine that your task is to design some kind of vowel harmony experiment, and you're going to have American English speakers. I've put here a sort of table with the American English vowels for people who aren't phonologists, with the sort of indication of what the sort of featural breakdown of them is. So if you're not proficient in IPA, starting from the top on the left, that's E, I, A, E, A. And then in the back, starting at the top, we have U, O, and then and O and A. Okay, so I'd like your thoughts. There's a lot that could be said about this. So I've left it perfectly a bit vague about what kind of vowel harmony experiment we're doing. It could be front-back harmony, it could be height harmony, it could be, you know, any of this kind of thing, rounding harmony. But what are some like issues that sort of come up if you're faced with, okay, I'm going to design a vowel harmony experiment for American English speakers. Here are the vowels I have to work with in that inventory. This, by the way, is a very realistic like thing that you will face designing phonology experiments, this very kind of question. So what are some thoughts that people have about problems or issues or things to think about? Alex, I'm going to put you on the spot. What's pick some issue from this that you could point out as an example of some problem that might come out of this.
Well, we have a comment in the chat that I realized I forgot you said that you can't see.
Oh,
also, your
sorry.
camera's off, just in case you didn't know that.
My camera's off.
Yes. So Jorge says one important thing that jumps out when you look at this type of thing is, does the L1 have an inventory that allows us to establish the contrast necessary for the manipulation you want to do? So for example, you mentioned rounding vowel harmony. If we wanted to run an experiment on rounding vowel harmony in English, that looks like it might be a difficult task for us.
Is my camera on now?
No.
What? It says it's on for
So
me.
I think maybe it's not that it's off, but sometimes Teams just like turns one camera off for you not to have so many.
I apologize. Well, your camera was off for me, at least.
Oh, okay. Jenny, you're on mute if you're talking to us.
Sorry, I was just saying I also don't see you, but I'm not really sure what to do about it because I don't think that many people have their cameras on right now, so I don't know why it's doing that.
If I pin, so I pinned him now. I pinned you, Jamie, but I still don't see your camera. Does that pin it for everyone? No. Okay.
Yeah, it's funny.
Weird.
I could try to rejoin if that's helpful. Maybe that's...
Yeah, maybe Alex can talk more about this and then
Sure.
Try.
Should I rejoin?
Yeah, why don't you try?
Okay.
I also can't see you. Yeah, okay. Okay, so it was so funny because I was just writing like, oh, I have comments about this. Right, so I think the thing that's oh, well, Jorge, did you want to say, sorry, next time I'll just speak out loud. I didn't realize Jamie can read the chat. Oh yeah. Well, so do you want to expand on that a little bit then, Jorge?
No. I was just literally saying that well, because I don't do phonology, what
Okay, yeah.
clearly was easy to see was that, well, there's gaps in that
Exactly, yeah.
in that repertoire, right? And so inventory. So you're gonna have trouble when you, I mean, if you want to establish like a perfect matrix of contrasts. I don't know if you're gonna need all contrasts or not, but I mean, when you have something that's natural and normally has gaps, like that's the problem, kind of problems you're gonna have, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I
Is the
see.
camera on?
I
Okay. Cool.
Sorry, you can pick back up now. I'll shut up.
Okay, so yeah, I heard something about gaps. That's about all I heard. But yes, there are gaps. So yeah, that's going to be sort of, it's sort of like what Alex was saying before as well. Like if there's certain kinds of contrast you want to test, then there's just gaps in the inventory. So, you know, like he was saying, if you want to do rounding harmony, well, there's one pair basically of vowels that have a rounding distinction and no other difference. So that's going to be a bit tough unless you're going to sort of conflate rounding harmony with something else. Other things?
I think maybe like one of the issues here would be that even if you kind of make it for your stimuli to be counterbalanced, so in a very nice design, it may not be then representative of English or the language that you're targeting.
Yep. So what do you mean by not representative of English exactly?
That maybe so that's the vowel inventory for English, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, there are not so the low back vowel doesn't happen that much as another kind of vowel or in a different position. So maybe it's not really mirroring the English distribution of these vowels.
Yeah, that's true. So that may be a good or a bad thing, right? So that's, in some sense, it could be bad if we're worried about, they may think that there's something weird about it. But on the other hand, it could be good if we want them to really think, okay, this isn't English, and get them out of the sphere of thinking that this is English.
Yeah, but in the end, we want to test real language, right? So natural language. So we want to know how this is learned or how this is processed. And the farther away we go from natural language, then I think somehow we're getting into other troubles as well. So yeah, I mean, it could be good so that it's super controlled. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we want to maybe not get away from natural language in the sense that maybe it's odd to test patterns that don't occur in any natural language unless we're trying to show that people can't learn them or something. But in fact, I think often we do want to get away from the speaker's first language, because that's why, for instance, if we are testing vowel harmony, we usually don't want to test vowel harmony, say, aside from certain, goals. We normally wouldn't test that with the Hungarian speaker or a Turkish speaker or something, because we don't want them to just map whatever pattern from their native language onto this artificial language. We want to know what people that don't have this pattern in their native language will do. I think I think we're even better able to do that in phonology sometimes than, at least my impression is, in like syntax and other kinds of areas, because I think I've talked with Jetty, like every language has word order, so it's really hard to get away from like the fact that every language has some word order, but not every language has vowel harmony. So we can actually somewhat get away from the issue that people are just going to map from their native language onto, whatever language this is. Most English speakers have no concept of what vowel harmony even is, naive English speakers. Yeah, other thoughts? So one issue that has definitely come up in experiments that I've thought about is if you want to do some kind of height harmony experiment, you come up with some issues, which is that in some sense, we have a lot of heights in English if you kind of just look at it in a, straightforward sense. But at the same time, we have this sort of tense lax issue going on, which is that it's not at all clear that, for instance, an English speaker will think that is sort of the same as like oh. Sorry, as like is the same as like ooh. Sorry, that's better. Because they're sort of, one is tense and one is lax, and you have the same issue we talked about earlier, which is that in English they pattern differently. They have different phonotactic restrictions. You can't have a word just bu, for instance. You can't have a word that ends like that, but you can boo. So it's not at all clear that they will sort of treat those as sort of the same category in some sense. You have the issue that if you want to do the front and the back vowels height harmony, you'll notice that the front is maybe fine because you have all of these front unrounded vowels, but at least for American English in the back, we have no low back rounded vowel, but most of the back vowels are rounded. So then you're thinking, okay, is it going to be okay to just put this low unrounded vowel in with all of these back rounded vowels, or is that going to throw things off? Or are people going to think that that's different and shouldn't be part of the same height harmony system? Who knows? You had the issue with these diphthongs. So you have English has these lovely diphthongs in the mid vowel zone here. So you give someone a, if you use a, then that's sort of a vowel that starts mid and goes high. So, are people going to treat that as a mid vowel or a high vowel or both, or what are they going to do? If you want to avoid this, maybe you give them monophthongs, but now that's not a vowel that they're used to hearing, at least in American English. So you give them the vowel a. How are they going to interpret that vowel? Are they going to sort of interpret it in its featural slot or not? We don't know. Yeah, so there's actually a lot of issues that will come up when you're looking at, okay, we have this great idea to do this vowel harmony experiment. We want to use English speakers. Then we look at the vowel inventory of English and we're like, oh, there's all these problems. Like, how do we navigate these problems? What decisions are we going to make? There's no perfect solution. So what are we going to do to sort of make the best of what we have to work with? Okay. Any questions about that? Okay. So I'd say some things to think about phoneme inventory is that generally I would say for phonology experiments, you want to use sounds that are phonemic or contrastive in the first language of the speakers, or at least easily distinguished in their first language. So basically that ensures that it ensures that they're going to interpret the sounds distinctly from each other, and probably that they're going to interpret it roughly like you have in mind. So for instance, you can see that a number of studies with English speakers involve palatalization. Well, palatalization is a great kind of change to use because English has t and ch, for instance, as separate phonemes. So if you give someone to suit, to suchi, any English speaker is going to reliably sort of interpret those as two distinct sounds and, close to what you intend them to be. I wouldn't, for instance, with English speakers, recommend doing some kind of study on palatal laterality, where you have this this is a palatal lateral, this first sound spelled like GL in Italian. And then, so I wouldn't suggest some kind of pattern where you have that sound become lose its laterality and become la yaka. I can sort of guarantee to you out of years of teaching phonetics that English speakers cannot hear the difference in these two sounds. So if you try to do an experiment, having English speakers learn that, say, ya changes to ya, they're not going to hear the difference. I think non-contrastive sounds that are sort of easily distinguished might be okay. So a pattern like an English speaker teaching them something like pataki becomes patach. It's probably okay because, okay, we don't have in English, but English speakers will definitely hear that as a different sound than K, I think. But we should keep in mind that there might be some kind of uncertainty about how these sounds will be categorized featurally because it's not a sound in the inventory. And if you're unsure about how people are interpreting your stimuli, then the best thing to do is to do a pilot study that includes some kind of discrimination experiment. That's the only way to be perfectly sure that people are really distinguishing the sounds that or not, is you just have them do some kind of AXB or some kind of discrimination experiment with the sounds involved. This kind of thing can be a nightmare, like in surprising places. So one of our PhD students at UCL a bit ago wanted to do an experiment with English speakers with vowel harmony, like a height harmony thing, sort of like I was talking about. And he was using sort of back rounded vowels in Southern British English. And so they have this sort of low back rounded vowel, all, like that you get in like Potter, like Harry Potter, like that all vowel. So using that as sort of one of the vowels in this experiment, and the results kept coming out very weirdly with just that vowel. Like after like several tries, just the results were weird. And finally, he did a discrimination experiment and figured out that even though this vowel is in Southern British English, speakers have a hard time distinguishing it from O, like the mid vowel, the mid-rounded vowel. So even though these are like two separate phonemes, in the context of the experimental stimuli, native speakers were struggling to tell the difference between them. So these issues can arise sort of in unexpected places. Okay. All right, something else you want to think about is word shape and length. So properties of the words, structure of the words. This issue came up when we were sort of brainstorming. So let me just give you some possible stem types here. So you could have very short stems like ka, ti, bu, si, la, gu. That's possible. You could have consonant kas, tik, bus, sin, laf, gut. Longer kasi, tiku, busa, sini, lafa, guti. Even longer kasit, tikun, busak, sinip, so on. You could add like a consonant cluster in the middle, kaspit, tikmun, bustak, sinkip. And you could get even longer, so kasitapi, tikunali, busakapu, sinipika. Okay, so you could design like words that have any of these shapes. So what are some thoughts that you guys might have about what picking different shapes sort of on this chart might do for your experiment? Like what might be some effects of picking different shapes like this?
Like length, the lengthier the stem, I mean, you complicate learnability, I guess, right? Or
sure, say more.
So with longer stems, they're probably harder to learn, right?
Yeah, harder to learn in what way?
They're just literally harder to memorize, I guess.
For sure, yeah. So definitely would be harder to memorize, I think.
Right.
What do you think about?
I understand from the example that you gave before that of course you sometimes need longer stems because you're testing something like this harmony stuff that you were saying, right? And then you just need more occurrences of the phenomenon. But I guess the longer the stem, the harder it is to memorize a word.
Yeah, for sure. So longer words are definitely going to be hard for people to sort of memorize or recognize potentially if that's part of what they need to be doing. What about like a softer learning situation where you're not really asking or wanting people to memorize the word per se, you just want them to notice and remember some kind of pattern affecting a small part of that word? What do you think effect that might have?
I mean, I guess it depends, or that will interact a little bit with the kind of questions that you have, or not, sorry, with the kind of like training that you're given, right? If it's explicit and you're asking them to pay attention to one part of the word explicitly, then I guess you don't, the fact that there's more material in the word doesn't necessarily distract them so much. But if it's implicit, you might be distracting attention from, let's say, the suffix if you want them to be paying attention to that, or some other part of the word.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah. And then so sort of implicitly in what you said is the word, I think, is if the words are shorter, then there's less sort of distracting material, right? There's less that can sort of draw their attention away from whatever part of the word you're interested in.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's a pretty good summary. I think I would say that I tend to use CV syllables as sort of a default general use template. I guess there's a couple of reasons for this. CV is sort of the default syllable template in the world's languages, the most common one. There's, when you get sort of consonant clusters, that tends to make things less distinguishable for people. So consonants are easier to perceive when they're next to vowels. So having the CV, 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 it makes everything nice and perceptible. So I tend to use that as a kind of general use template. In terms of word length, I think really short stems may be too short. Part of the reason there is that it's kind of hard to avoid sounding like real words, especially in some languages. So in English, you're going to be really hard pressed to come up with a lot of CVC words that aren't already words or don't sound like real words. It's also difficult to have a lot of distinct stems or a lot of variety in the kinds of stems that you have. So those are maybe a bit short. Really long words are probably too long unless you need it by the design. Like we were saying, the study that Alex and I did, we needed these long 4-syllable words. These sort of, as you were saying, they can start feeling kind of overwhelming. They can obscure the pattern that you're interested in. If it's just at the end, but they have these really long words that they're trying to sort of remember-ish, then it can kind of distract them away from the pattern. And it's a bit more difficult to control everything, maybe. So you might have noticed in the experiments I talked about, I think for me a sort of happy medium that I tend to go to is this sort of CVCV or maybe CVCVC kind of template for most uses, kind of a middle of the road. It's easy enough to make them sound different from each other without them being super long.
Can I inject some non-phonology concerns
Please.
for?
Yeah.
Well, they're not concerns. They're more just like
Please.
ideas for solutions. So if you're, if this is not really something that's like key to your study, but really what you need to do is just like come up with some words, and for example, that you don't want some of them to be really close to English words and others to be really far from English words. So maybe you want to control for phonotactic probability. Like maybe you have two categories of words you want people to learn, and you want them to be like well balanced in terms of the types of words that are in those. There's actually some really nice resources already available. So like you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like for one, you can use words that other people have already used. For two, I mean, I'll post it in the chat, but there's like a giant list of words with normed information about how they, like their phonotactic probability in English. Annoyingly, all this stuff is available in English and not in other languages. So hopefully that changes. Maybe there's some available.
There are, yeah. So I mean, depending on the language of your participants, there's definitely resources for French, for example, from the Lexique website. There are. So if you look, I think these things tend to be tied with corpora because so if you have a corpus for a certain language, it's possible that there are tools. Silex for German, we see, that are part of that suite that will draw their phonotactic probabilities from the corpora, and then you have a pseudo word generator. So those types of tools are more and more common. So definitely look for those if you're not interested in manipulating the phonology.
It's just to say that if that's not something that you're interested in, there's a lot of help available, so that you can like you don't have to worry about those things. Someone has already worried about them for you, and you can just kind of have an easier job of picking your stems.
Good. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, next point. Okay, so another thing that we definitely need to do is control extraneous variables. So an extraneous variable is anything that's sort of not the variable that we're interested in, but just something else that could differ, that could, that could, in theory, cause a difference in the results, or could vary with the variables could vary alongside the variables that we are interested in, which would be problematic. So I just put a little example here. So this would be a study, say, where we have this lovely palatalization rule again. So what seems problematic? If you have to look at this, what might you say if you're like giving someone feedback on their stimuli? Then what might you look at this and be like, maybe I would change something?
In the right-hand column, all of the words end on voiceless sounds, and in the left-hand column, there's a mixture of voicing.
True. That bit would be by design, though, because, sorry, I should say I didn't give you enough information. The information here is that the pattern to be learned here is t becomes ch and d becomes j. And basically any other consonant at the end of the word wouldn't change into anything else. So the sort of colored in sounds are the ones that are part of the sort of design. So there's something hidden in the rest of the sounds that is sort of maybe an extraneous variable that we might be concerned about. Oh wait, there's a problem. Oh, there's a bad issue here. Oh no. There's a bigger problem than I had in mind. Don't mind me. Oops. Copy and
How many of
paste.
you did not see that error at all anywhere by chance?
Why?
I don't think any. I mean, Jenny and I seem to not have noticed that. Definitely blurred over that.
Yeah, I obviously didn't notice this when making the slides or when looking back at them. So that similarity was not intentional. Okay, this is better. Okay, now.
I think all the words end in I, so I see this as a problem. Maybe it's not.
That's also by design. Sorry, this would be like, imagine that the E is like a plural suffix.
Ah, okay.
You just have one word starting with L. All the rest is with K, so you might think that you have palatalization only when you have K.
Good. Yeah,
And
exactly.
so if you made something else, you will just think it's regular.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I had in mind here. So you'll see that all of the cases on the left where you get the palatalization, except for one, happen to start with K. In all the cases, on the case on the right here, we happen just not to have any K at the beginning of the word. So this is a case of what I was saying where you may think that something seems like a stupid generalization. Like, who's going to look at these things and learn like, oh, when the word starts with K, I need to palatalize the last sound. Sounds like a dumb generalization from the point of view of a linguist, but these are kinds of things that people can and will like pick up on. So these are the kinds of things that you have to be careful about not accidentally putting into your experiment. And these kinds of things can easily happen. So, is a common thing if you want to create stimuli that you just sort of, you come up with your phoneme inventory and then you use Excel or a script or something and randomly sort of split out the consonants and the vowels and generate words. And if you do some kind of process like this without checking them carefully, it's really easy to come up with a situation where you accidentally have this kind of accidental pattern in your data that people can pick up on. And of course, it doesn't have to be perfect, which is why I put that one little L in there. Even if there's just enough of a sort of probabilistic pattern there, people can pick up on that and do well enough to do over chance performance, right? Even if they don't get everything right, they'll do over chance performance, and it'll look like they've learned something. And maybe they have learned something, but they haven't learned what you thought they were learning. Okay, so this is the kind of thing I mean by like extraneous variables that you have to just be careful about. Obviously, this is a bit of an extreme example, but okay. So you want to avoid sort of these accidental generalizations. So you generally want, for phonology at least, to use consonants and vowels about equally. So in total, you want them to be used about the same, and in each position, you want them to be used about the same, other than what you need to do because of the design, of course. This is really true, especially if you have few items. So if you're doing an experiment where you're going to only have a small number of items, then it's really important that everything is like perfectly controlled, because those items are going to mean more individually if you don't have many of them. If you have a bunch of different kinds of items, then roughly balanced is usually fine, because people are not going to pick up, if they're learning like 70 different kinds of words or hearing 70 different kinds of words, they're less likely to sort of pick up on these little, you know, minor differences in distribution. Like it roughly balanced is usually fine for that. Depending on the sort of design and the number of items you have, it may even be desirable to balance the CV syllables, the consonant-consonant sequences, the vowel-vowel sequences, just to make sure there's nothing in there that's an accidental pattern that people could pick up on. Okay. The other thing you want to do is, we mentioned this before, avoid items that sound like real words or phrases. These are especially salient to people. So in English, things like Tony, gazebo is one that I've actually snuck into my experiment before, and a lot of people afterwards said, "Oh yeah, I recognize the word gazebo." So it's not one that I noticed when I was checking the words, but it's something that people pick up on. Gazebo sounds like a word. Even something like daki, like, which if you're just looking at it, you think that's not a word, but it sounds like the key, daki.
Can I also
Go
recommend
see.
that if you're not a native speaker of the dialect and the place where you live, you should definitely ask a native speaker who is, because I miss things all the time that my colleague Kenny is like, no, that's a word, that's a word, that's a word.
Yep, definitely. I'd actually recommend you have if you can, have someone check even if it is the same, just because it's really easy when you make them to sort of overlook things, or, sort of like when you write your own paper, it's easy to sort of read it the way you meant to say it rather than what you actually wrote. So it's good to have someone else kind of look over them. French is a nightmare, as we've discovered. Basically anything, so like les bas, like basically anything starting with les, la, me, ma, de, any of these like sequences sounds like a phrase in French, because these are all sort of articles. So French is a nightmare in this regard, but basically whatever language your participants are coming from, you have to be really mindful of what's going to sound like words and phrases in that language when you're doing stimuli, because those will stick out and be really salient to people.
Do you guys have any experience or ideas if you're doing these experiments in a language that has like very restrictive syllable structures or word structures? Like, I don't know. Like, what if you're doing this in a language that has very short words and that's the only type of word that's available?
Are you talking to me or in general?
Yeah, I'm talking to you, but if any, I mean, that's sorry. I see that that's ambiguous. Yeah, but if anyone else has thoughts about it, go for it.
Do you mean like Chinese, for instance? Yeah. To be fair, I've only ever run one experiment with Chinese speakers, or actually a student of mine did. And it was a version of like one of the vowel harmony experiments I already showed you. So in that case, we didn't try to stick to Chinese phonotactics or syllable structure or anything. We just gave them stimuli that aren't Chinese-like. I think it would be very challenging to do a study where you were really trying to stick strictly to Chinese syllable structure. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts, Alex?
Yeah, well, so the main thing that I mean, we ran into this in a different way, not about the syllable structure, but we were working with Thai on, which is tonal language, on the fact that tone wasn't part of our manipulation, but it's something that native speakers of Thai will perceive on the items anyway. And so it wound up being something we had to build in. And so it winds up being, and I mean, this kind of summarizes to about all these issues that we've been talking about. How are your participants going to perceive the manipulation you're doing?
This was a syntax experiment, not a phonology.
That was a syntax experiment. So in addition, didn't have anything to do with phonology.
Yes, these things are relevant no matter what.
Indeed, yes. But so in the case of a language with a restricted syllable or word form, even in the case of Chinese, what I think matters most is how your participants are going to perceive your sequences of syllables. And so it's potentially not problematic that, you have to make sure you're not using, for example, consonant clusters that don't exist in the language that you're targeting, because they'll be perceived as, for example, having an epithetic vowel that you're not controlling the features for. If it's with a tonal language, you have to make sure that you've tested to make sure that the tones are perceived in a certain way, or that your stimuli are recorded specifically with tones on them. And in the case of, for example, a language like Chinese, if you are using CV words, as long as those aren't being perceived with epenthetic consonants or vowels, the fact that they don't necessarily look like I guess the CV word does look like a disyllable Chinese word, but it all boils down to how are your participants going to be perceiving these sounds. And like Jamie said, you can do a lot of this with piloting and pre-testing to sort of make sure that not only is your manipulation perceptible, but there aren't things in your stimuli that are being perceived that are going to mess up the manipulation that you're doing later. The tonal example came to mind specifically because of that, exactly in the case where we were working on a syntax experiment, but where in order to make sure our words in our experiment weren't real words in Thai, we had to make sure that the tones that we were using didn't correspond to certain word forms that had that tone in them in Thai.
Yeah, that was an excellent question. Yeah. Good. Okay. Another thing to think about is the inventory size. So we talked a bit about what is in the inventory of the language, but if you're using a small inventory size in your artificial language, something to keep in mind is that it's usually easier to control because there's less sounds to worry about where they go, but it's also much more important that you control things, because if there's fewer sounds there, there's a bigger chance that they're going to accidentally end up in this arrangement where, probabilistically there are more of them in some position than other positions or something like that. A thing to keep in mind is that if you use a small inventory size, an effect of that is that your words in your language start sounding really, really, really similar to each other. It's difficult with a small inventory to make words that really sound different from each other once you play a bunch of them. So that could be good or bad depending on your study. Whereas with a larger phoneme inventory, it's harder to control perfectly, but roughly balanced is more okay if you have a lot of different sounds that you're using. And the words tend to sound more distinct from each other just by nature of having more sounds involved. So, in theory, that probably sounds a bit more realistic than if you are trying to make a language with 3 vowels and 3 consonants or something. Okay, so this point is very much related to the tone point, where tone language speakers will sort of create tone there, even if there's not one, they'll hear tone. So stress language speakers will also usually kind of do something with the stress, even if it weren't there. So you kind of need to think about the stress if you're going to have speakers of a stress language. So which syllable is it going to be on? Is it going to be pikuta or pikuta or bikuta? You need to sort of decide that in advance. You should be mindful that stress is going to probably impact the interpretation and or the salience of various parts of the word with speakers of a stress language. So English speakers will tend to sort of pay a bit more attention to the sounds around the sort of stress part of the word, the stress syllable. That's sort of like a prominent position for English speakers. You need to think about if you have alternations, is the stress going to shift when you add morphemes? So are you going to have a situation like pikut, pikuchi, where there's no shift, or pikut, pikuchi, no shift? Or are you going to have a situation where the stress shifts? So pikut becomes pikuchi, or pikut becomes pikuchi. So you have to think about these kinds of questions. Personally, I tend to favor a sort of stem-bounded stress pattern so that the stress doesn't have to shift. So a case more like, I like words like pikut, pikuchi, just so it's one less thing changing to worry about. Probably that's less common typologically, though it is attested, but it reduces a lot of extraneous things to worry about when you don't have to worry about the stress shifting. If stress isn't something that you actually care about in the experiment. Okay, another issue you have to think about, how many items or trials are you going to include in your experiment? So you need enough items or trials to allow participants to learn the pattern, of course. You maybe discourage them from focusing too much on memorizing specific items. So if you only have 5 items, then they're going to memorize those 5 items. And if you don't want that, then you need more items than that, right? And also it helps ensure that there aren't these accidental patterns there that people can find and focus on that we talked about. The more different kinds of items and trials that you have, the less likely it is that that people are going to find these little accidental patterns in there. On the other hand, too many items or too many trials can cause a ceiling effect. So we talked about this earlier. If you're not using that extrapolation paradigm, then if you have, hundreds of training trials, then you're likely to get a ceiling effect where people will just learn everything. So you don't want too many items in that case. That's where piloting, again, comes into play. Another issue is that it can sort of cause the experiment to be really long and sap the motivation late in the study. So if you have a whole bunch of trials and people get bored, then your data in the last half of the study may be not so good, not so helpful. Okay, another thing is whether you're going to have many distinct kinds of items or you're going to repeat items. So having a bunch of distinct items is going to encourage people to find the sort of broad generalizations because they can't remember the individual items well. If you have 70 trials and they're all different words, people aren't going to remember those words. So they're going to have to focus more on the broad generalizations they can find. If you have 5 words that you repeat 20 times each, then they're going to memorize the words and they can focus more on individual things about those words. If you have a lot of different kinds of items, it's kind of okay again for the properties to be a bit more roughly balanced because again, they're not going to pick up on them as much. But it's also harder to set up. More recording time, more balancing to be done. I think that's why a lot of times people do sort of repeat trials a little bit. If you have fewer trials and more repetition, then you have sort of the inverse of all of that. Okay, another thing to think about is your trained and novel items. So usually in your test trials, you can have trained, old, or familiar items, they might be called. So these are going to be items that you repeat from the training into the test phase. And you can have novel items, so things that they only see in the test phase. I think depending on your design, often it's a good idea to include both types in the test phase if that's something that makes sense for your design. The trained items are nice because they sort of let you ensure that the participants actually learned something and paid attention. They give you that sort of sanity check. They also let you do things sort of like what Alex and I did in the paper I talked about earlier today, that you could go in and say, okay, we're going to take the people that obviously learned really well the training items and then do a sub-analysis on those people and see what they did. So having those trained items can help you do that sort of thing. And then you also definitely have to have your novel items. This is what's going to show you whether or not participants extracted the sort of general pattern. If you only use trained items, then there's a chance that whatever they do could just be memorized or recognized from training and not really represent something that they've learned as general.
Jamie,
Yes.
can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
Is there a good way to decide which one? Because presumably when you prepare your stimuli, you create both trained and novel items at the same time. Like there's no distinction in principle, right? They only became trained and novel items when you decide which ones go to which phase. Or is there a way to, I mean, how do you do it? For example, do you just like roll dice, or when it comes to saying, okay, I have these 60 items, this 30 are going to be in the training and then in the test phase as trained items, and these are they're not going to see into the test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so basically often what I do is usually there's some kind of counterbalancing or controlling measures taken in the list of stimuli that you're creating, right? So basically you want your subsetting to be such that those controls hold in your two sets, right? So if you make a list of 60 stimuli and you control how often each consonant goes in first position,
right,
then you want to make sure that when you subset that, like you don't want to do a random roll per se, because then you can again end up with these sort of accidental.
Yeah, sure.
Things.
Yeah. Within counterbalancing, then there's no like good way to decide which ones are. You just like have to say, okay.
Beyond that, yeah.
Right.
Beyond that, as long as everything stays like nice and controlled, then I don't think there's a clear way to do it. You just kind of pick.
It's again my paranoia with between and within stuff, right? Like this now it's between items, and I'm always like I never know what to. But I guess you need to stop worrying at some point, or you go mad.
The best situation is if you have to do between subjects. I think that you can use your test items and training items from one condition into the other with minimal change.
Right.
So that way, most of the controlling factors stay controlled, and then you just change the tiny little manipulation you need to make it appropriate for the other condition. I think that's the best situation if you can do that. You can't always do that, but I think that's the best.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. So that's often like harmony, disharmony, like often we'll make the harmony stimuli, and then to make the disharmony ones, we'll just change the frontness value of the second vowel for all of them, so that all the controlling measures stay in place, and then you have both conditions. Sorry, Jenny. Go ahead.
Sorry, I keep injecting with like non-phonologist things, but just in case people are also thinking about these things in the background. I mean, I don't think this is exactly the same for syntax experiments. So in many of my experiments, there's not such a clear need for novel items. Like, you know, we're teaching people a couple of vocabulary items and we want to teach them a new word order. We don't necessarily always ask them, okay, make the new word order, but with items you've not seen before. We don't always do that. Sometimes we do. And of course, in extrapolation, your novel items are not like the trained items on purpose. So it's not, yeah, it really depends on what your design is and what exactly it is that you're trying to get people to learn. Like exactly what the distinction between these items is and exactly how necessary it is that you have novel versus trained items.
Yeah. Yeah, I think with all of these things, it's sort of the thing that it's just things that you want to keep in mind. And when you sit down to design an experiment, you want to kind of go through all these sorts of questions and think about, this is what I want to do based on my design and my questions. You just want to make a active decision about all of these things. I think you don't want it to be an accident that like you're just doing it because. You want it to be an active decision that you've thought about and you think, do I need trained and novel items, or do I just need trained items, or do I just need novel items? You want it to be a sort of active decision that you're making in the process and not just do it just because, you know, no reason.
Well said.
Okay. There's a difference between your critical items and your filler items. So the critical ones are going to be the ones that you have to train or test the pattern, of course. The filler items are the ones that aren't really important for the analysis usually, but you sort of use them to round out the experiment. So the kind of purpose of them is that they can be used to sort of distract from the patterns or the sounds of interest. At least in phonology experiments, you can do that. So, you know, if you just include your critical items, people are going to quickly figure out what it is that you're asking them to focus on, or you want them to focus on. You can use it to establish sort of phonotactic facts or other properties about the language. So you might have noticed in some of the studies I mentioned earlier, things like there were all these filler sounds that didn't alternate, just so they recognize that it's not the case that all sounds alternate. It's just these certain sounds that alternate. The rest of them behave normally and don't change. And it can also sort of make the language, I think, seem a bit more realistic, to have a wider variety of words that people hear. So it's not just like this really, it's a little bit less artificial sounding with all these words that happen to have like the exact same shape, exact same thing going on. But again, something to think about. How many filler items do I want? What kinds of filler items do I want? Is something that you have to actively sort of think about making a decision about. Okay, this is an issue for phonology for sure. Will you record your stimuli or synthesize your stimuli? Probably an issue in syntax and stuff as well. Are these audible? I don't even know. I don't think I've shared sound. Okay, well, I think we don't need to hear them anyway.
There's if you want, Jamie, I saw earlier in the share content button, there's a separate box you can tick if you want to share your computer sounds.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me still? Okay. Can you hear it now? Okay, well, I don't think you necessarily need to hear it. But you always will need to make a decision about whether or not you're going to record your stimuli.
We're in your presenter view.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
No. Now?
Gizu.
Oh, good. We can hear it now.
Okay. So let's just give you, so these are just some examples of, I tend to use recorded stimuli. No, it's Tal Linton. I tend to use recorded stimuli in most of my experiments, but so here's just some examples.
Gizu. Gizufi. Gizufu. Gizube. Gizubo.
Okay, so that's just like a set of recorded stimuli. Here's a set of synthesized stimuli that Alex actually put together just for something we were just thinking about.
Pain quichon. Pain quichon riz. Pain quichon roux. Pain qui rit. Pain qui roux.
Okay, so the latter was, is a kind of French voice. Okay, so you have to
Pain quichon.
Thank you.
Pain quichon riz.
Oh dear. Okay. All right. So it's it's a decision you have to make. So there are pros and cons of each. Recorded speech, the pros are it tends to sound a bit more natural. You can decide for yourself if you think that it sounded more natural, the natural recorded one. You can ask the speaker to speak in a certain way, like to do it in a certain kind of style. And the cons are you tend to get a bit more variability, which may be less of a concern if you have a lot of words. And it's time consuming because you have to record everything and splice everything, whatever. Synthesize, it can sound unnatural. It tends to sound a little bit unnatural, I think. You can't ask speakers to add specific features. Sorry, less variability should be a pro. And quicker and easier. Oh, they should be reversed, sorry. The pros are cons, the cons are pros. But it's the inverse, right, of everything else. It tends to be quicker and easier, especially if you have a lot of words, but I don't know, it's a decision you have to make. I tend to use recorded stimuli myself. I prefer doing that unless I have a ton of words I need to do. I like it to sound more natural. I think Alex tends to use synthesized stimuli more. But maybe that's not right.
Done, but it's always a measure of how many stimuli need to be recorded, because there is limit to the number of stimuli that one person can record. And usually when you're doing these recordings, you want multiple repetitions so that you can get the best tokens. And if you wind up with 400 individual items that you need across all of your conditions and you want them all to be the same, having someone repeat 400 non-words over and over again is not always doable. And so in those types of experiments, then I've used synthesized speech before, yeah.
Yeah, I think Tal was going to kill us literally when we were recording all of those that set came from.
That was about the most that we can do, I think. Poor Tal.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so it's a decision to be made. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer, but a decision to be made. If you are going to record, some issues you have to think of is who's going to record it. Do you want a native speaker of the participant's language, or do you want a speaker of a different language? And there are pros and cons to each of those decisions. How are you going to have the sounds be produced? So in that set, for instance, there we got Tal because he's a native Hebrew speaker. We wanted something different than our participants L1, but we asked him, please make the stops with a bit of aspiration, just so that our English speakers, for instance, can reliably for sure tell the difference between the voiced and the voiceless ones, because aspiration is very important in English. So you can ask them to like do things in a certain way just to make it a bit better for your purposes. Controlling or measuring or manipulating properties is always an issue. So equalizing for intensity is standard. That's something basically everybody does. Beyond that, controlling for like syllable duration or F0 or things like this might be desirable. Depends on your design and your needs. Okay. All right, so this is a thing that came up earlier as well. To use pictures or not to use pictures, at least in phonology experiments. Using pictures tends to make the task more interesting. It might distract somewhat from the pattern of interest because people do try to look into the pictures and find stuff there, so they may pay slightly less attention to the sounds of the words themselves, which may be good or not, depending on your purposes. I promise you that some participants will look for semantic patterns, so they will, even if it's not right, they'll come up with things like use "fee" suffix when the picture is out of it. Could be completely wrong, but they'll tell you that at the end, some people. And if you're going to use pictures, you need to be very careful that there's no accidental properties of the pictures that are confounded with the pattern. So you want to make sure that all the cases where there's an alternation, it's not also a fruit, for instance. We kind of talked about that earlier. So you really have to actually, part of your controlling process is carefully pairing up the pictures with the words to make sure there's no accidental patterns there. Not using pictures prevents participants from accidentally finding semantic patterns or looking for them. But the issue is it feels a bit boring, so motivation can sag fairly quickly when people are staring at a blank screen, just hearing a bunch of words come at them all the time. People tend not to like that as much as having the sort of pictures there. So you can make a decision about this. Normally I will include pictures because of the motivation issue. We did have an experiment that we worked on where we found that people needed to sort of learn to pass a criterion. And when we had the pictures, our attrition was too high. So we had too many people failing the experiment because they were focusing wrongly on the pictures. So in that particular experiment, we removed the pictures just to encourage people to listen to the words and not look at the pictures, and that helped. But generally, I tend to sort of go with pictures as a default. All right, we're almost done here. So the last thing that you might want to think about here is whether you sort of want to emphasize the pattern of interest a bit or obscure it a bit. And depending on your goals, you might want to do either of these things. And there's ways that you can kind of do both, like subtly. So if you want to emphasize the pattern, you can have a more explicit task. So make the alternations explicit, make the give feedback, make the instructions more explicit. Shorter words, like we said, will tend to emphasize the pattern of interest. Fewer filler items will make it easier for people to find the pattern of interest. If the target sounds are in prominent or salient positions, like at the beginning of the word versus the end of the word, people tend to kind of pick up on it a bit faster. Not having the pictures, that'll make people tune into the sounds a bit more. And then ways to obscure the pattern would be kind of the inverse of all of those. One additional thing here is that you can do, if you want to kind of obscure the pattern a bit, is add a sort of red herring pattern or red herring task in the instructions. And that will cause people to sort of not pay attention to what you want as much. So for instance, if you want people to learn alternations, phonological alternations, you could tell them something like, try your hardest to memorize these words. And we're going to test you on the words, or try your hardest to figure out which words go with which pictures. And we're going to test you on that at the end. But really, you don't want to test them on that. You want to test them on how much they learn the alternations. But that sort of thing can sort of draw people's attention away from consciously focusing on the task. Okay, so yeah, like all of these things, some of this is a bit phonology experiment specific, but I imagine like in syntax or semantics or any other area, this is also the kind of thing you might think about. Do we want to make the pattern more or less obvious to people? Do we want to obscure it? So these are kinds of questions you would still want to think about, I think. Okay, so that's all for this. I'm happy to talk about any questions or comments you have here. I think we have Gathertown after this. So I wanted to say that I'm also happy to sort of talk to you if you have specific experiments that you're planning on designing or specific questions you're thinking of designing an experiment about. I'm also more than happy to sort of listen to what you're thinking and give you some feedback on that, of course. Okay, that's all.
Thanks, Jamie. That was awesome.
Yeah, so I guess I hope a takeaway for you will be there's really a lot of things that you need to consciously think about when you're designing an experiment. And you should endeavor to think about all of these things, you know, that are relevant to your experiment very carefully.
Well, given that we hurled a bunch of questions at you during, maybe it makes sense for us all to head over to Gathertown and then we can talk amongst ourselves a bit more. Yeah, that's right, Jorge. Plenty of questions already came up.